Good morning, everyone. This is going to be part of our series entitled Deep Dives on Colossians 1, verses 14 to 18. And this first episode will be about the word prototokos, which appears in verse 15, which is translated in the King James as firstborn. But apparently, I got a lot of pushback. People don't believe Jesus was ever born by God or begotten by God. He had to be an eternal God from all time. So let's take a look at this. And I wouldn't have brought this up. Maybe you don't have this problem, most of you, but a lot of people brought this up, so I'm going to refute that because it's so obviously wrong. But let's take an open mind and let's listen to what the evidence is. So here's the word prototokos in verse 15, and this is Colossians 1, verse 15. This is Bible Hub's indication that to them it's obviously firstborn. Why? Because the prefix proto in Greek means what? First, and then the word tokos means childbirth. The people who are claiming it only means first are ignoring the word tokos, childbirth. I mean, it's as simple as that. However, let's just take it slow and make sure we don't make a mistake, because they're going to cite examples where somebody is called, the whole nation is called a prototokos. Well, so what? It doesn't mean they're an eternal being, which is where they're trying to drive it. Or just because someone is first or primary in something, protos, doesn't mean they're a tokos, childbirth, either. So it's just the confusion that they're in is causing a problem for them. And really what it is, it's doctrine. So let's take a look at the whole passage. Colossians 1, verse 14 to 18, in whom we have redemption. That's Jesus, through his blood, obviously Jesus, even the forgiveness of sins, who is the image of the invisible God. That has to be Jesus, the image of some other God, right? The Father, right? The firstborn of every creature. So now, who is the firstborn? Obviously, it's a reference back to Jesus. He's the firstborn, the prototokos of every creature. So he's the firstborn of all creatures. For him, by him, now Jesus, we're still talking about Jesus. It hasn't changed to God. It's still Jesus. For by him were all things created. They're in heaven and they're on earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist. And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. So who was the first person to resurrected? Who was first child born in that sense? Paul thinks it's Jesus, and he doesn't know of any other person who had been ever raised from the dead. And so that's a problem. He doesn't read the Gospels. So he even says, in Galatians 2, he says, I didn't get any of my truth from the apostles. I got it all from Revelation. You think I'm kidding you? Please read Galatians 2. They imparted nothing to me, even though they're pillars of the church. He says, I didn't want to get any of my truth from them. I wanted to get it from my revelations from Jesus above. So read that if you want to understand. He doesn't know Jesus raised somebody from the dead, a guy named Lazarus. Okay, but Jesus is saying Jesus is the firstborn from the dead. Impossible. Lazarus was the firstborn from the dead prior to Jesus. If anyone was resurrected, it had to at least be Lazarus, right? Okay. Anyway, and then it says that in all things, Jesus, might have the preeminence. So he makes Jesus more important than Yahweh. He's given him all preeminence because, in fact, he's also made him our only Father. The Father only begat Jesus, and Jesus begat the rest of humanity, the earth and creation, everything. All right, let's keep going. So people don't like that. Many responded to our Paul is an Herodian episode on Colossians 1, 15 to 18, saying prototokos does not mean firstborn, but rather means first or primary. Again, literally incorrect. So you have to accept literal truth. But why are they concerned? Because if Paul is true, Jesus is not an eternal son, and hence Paul contradicts that Jesus is truly God, necessarily an eternal being. Okay, so Paul would be an anti-Trinitarian. Okay, but he doesn't know that Paul's verse, this passage, was advanced by priest Arius at the Council of Nicaea to refute Trinitarian doctrine. So it was already understood. It was the grounds to refute Paul. So the meaning that anyone sees today, it was simply Paul was rejected. Paul was not that influential as of 325. He gained that influence later because of his anti-Sabbath positions. In Constantine's eyes, that was gold, and that's what changed his fate in time. But at that early time, determining if there's a deity in Jesus, it was more important to follow Athanasius, who made up actually follow nobody, because the doctrine is developed at Nicaea that has nothing to do with either the Athanasius party or the Arius party. It was Constantine created the solution, which we'll get into in a second. Well, here's the solution. Okay, so let me, with that background, so we should understand Protokos was understood by priest Arius and everybody else to be saying that Jesus was the firstborn of creation. And how was that to be reconciled with the Nicene Creed? And it's in here if you look carefully. So listen and pay attention to the Nicene Creed. This is the one that it got reissued in 381 AD when the Holy Spirit, for the first time, was considered a God separate and apart from the Son and separate apart from the Father, but somehow they're all in a council of a Godhead, and that makes them allegedly one. Listen to this. This is part of it, the opening. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty. So where's that coming from? That comes from Jesus' own mouth in John 17, 1-3. So this is what the Nicene Conference opened with. The argument of the anti-Trinitarian party was Jesus said he's the only true God. So it's accepted here that God is the only Father. There is one God, the Father. So they're not disputing, the Trinitarians are saying, we're not disputing there's only one God, the Father. Do you see that? You'll see why in a minute, how they get around and make Jesus a second God. Maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord, Jesus Christ. So they love that word Lord because it makes you think, is that God? No, it's just the word master. It can be master. It can also mean a word for God, but that's in Hebrew. It was a different letter at the end, Adoni, I think it is, and the other is Adonai. So based on that, the Jews knew that the word Lord did not mean Lord of the heavens, just would mean a master on earth. Anyway, so it's an ambiguous term so far. The only begotten Son of God. So is Jesus begotten? That's what the Nicene Creed says. Where are they getting that from? They're actually getting it right from this passage because that's what Paul is saying. He's the firstborn, meaning he's the first begotten. And what kind of person would he be? He'd have to be the Son of God. And that's key to then understanding, did Paul mean that he's Jesus, the Son of God? Because I'm going to race ahead here to show you something that Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 24-25, 24-28 says Jesus is the Son of God. Do you see down here in verse 28? And then shall the Son also himself be subject to him, the Father. So Paul believes Jesus is the Son of God. I know that seems odd. I have to prove that to people, but there are people here who believe Jesus is an eternal being and he was never really begotten in any sense, way, or shape, or form. Okay, that's what they were writing to me. So you may not fall into this camp, but it's still, if you're not in that camp, you still get educated to know this argument, and hopefully, if these people bring up their arguments, you'll realize how futile they are and irrelevant. Like I said, it's irrelevant that Ephraim is called the Protokos as well, a whole nation of people, but that's actually the name of a person as well. And just so you know, primogeniture was the law in the Bible, in the law, the Torah. So the firstborn son inherits everything, and that the reason for that is he takes the position of the father, and then he takes care of the family. If he dies, then the next in line takes care of the family. So the idea of primogeniture was an idea of keeping a family intact even when the father dies. But anyway, let's move on. But here, I just want to show you something here. Now, I'm going to read you Psalm 2 first, and then I'm going to show you Paul quotes Psalm 2. So in Psalm 2, it's about the Messiah. The prophecy of Messiah is right here. There are only two passages in the Law and Prophets that talk about Messiah. Did you know that? That literally used the word. And it's in Daniel 9, 25 and 26, the prophecy of Messiah there, and it's here. And this is a very important passage, but Christians are never explained to it because exactly this is it runs counter to the idea that God begot Jesus in any capacity, because even this passage offends Trinitarian ears. But here's what it says. The kings of the earth stand, and the rulers take counsel against Yahweh and against his anointed, saying, let's break their bonds and cast their cords from us. People don't want to listen to what Jesus says, nor do they want to listen to what Yahweh says. So they create dispensational doctrine. They can only have to follow some guy who says there's nothing to follow at all. Just believe in the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus. I just want to show you this is very prophetic right here. It's right pointing at Paulinism right there. Let's continue. Yet I have set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree. The Lord has said unto me, thou art my son. This day have I begotten thee. This is the proof positive that Jesus was the begotten Son of God. Now, you have to know that Augustine, who ran the conference of 393 at Hippo to determine canon, was the person who gets rid of two passages from the Bible in Matthew and Luke, or obviously it's him because he loses the debate in 383 about this very passage. And this passage was used to refute that Jesus is an eternal Son of God when it was actually spoken by Yahweh over Jesus' head at the baptism of his account. All the texts in Matthew, not one is missing them from the earliest time until after Hippo. And all of them of Luke also have it, except just one text is missing it, and that's it. And yet it's gone from the Latin Vulgate of 405, and then all the Greek manuscripts started to remove it from the Greek manuscripts all after 405 AD, beginning around the first millennia. Okay? But what we need to know is this is prophetically about Jesus. So whatever Jerome did or whatever Augustine did to get rid of this message that we couldn't hear it anymore, be suppressed, was futile because Paul actually quotes it. Okay, it's right here in Acts 13:16. Then Paul stood up and beckoning with his hand said, Men of Israel, and ye that fear God, give audience. God has fulfilled the same unto us, their children, in that he has raised up Jesus again. And as it is also written in the second Psalm, Thou art my son, this day I begotten thee. So Paul knew this passage I'm telling you about that's been removed. And God has fulfilled the same. So this is true. He's saying that his son, who he begat, is the Messiah. And this is his proof, citing Psalm 2. So Paul knows what I'm telling you, and there's no way around it. Okay. So let's see here. So I just want to show you, I think I've already explained this to you, but I also want to show you that according to Paul, Jesus, after conquering all the enemies of the Father, so he had an initial preeminence by this passage we read earlier in Colossians. He has preeminence even over the Father. What is the ultimate and final state of the Son and the Father? Well, interestingly, Paul says the Son is eternally subject to the Father. And that also offends Trinitarian ears. So I'm going to read it to you so that if you're a Trinitarian, you can start learning that whatever you think you believe, Paul doesn't agree with it. Not that I'm endorsing Paul, but I'm just saying, how can Paul get it so wrong? And if he does get it that wrong, and you believe in Paul, you have to kind of let your faith belief swing over to Jesus, because Jesus is very clear. The Father is the only true God. That's John 17:1-3. But Paul right here is going to destroy what you think is Trinitarianism if you believe in Trinitarianism. So let's listen to this. Verse 24. Then comes the end, when he shall have delivered up the kingdom to God. That's Jesus delivering the kingdom to God, the Father. When he shall have put down all rule and all authority and power. I'm going to pause there. So that's actually the conclusion. And when we get to verse 28, he's going to repeat that conclusion. So everything you're reading now is the premises and then the conclusion. Premise number 1, verse 25. For Jesus, he must reign till he, Jesus, has put all enemies under his feet. So Jesus is going to have preeminence for a long period of time until all enemies of God are under Jesus's feet. Verse 26. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. Verse 27. For he has put all things under his feet. But when he, and I believe this is the Father when you read the whole thing, but when he, the Father, says all things are put under him, that is Jesus, it is manifested that he, the Father, is accepted, meaning he's not under Jesus, which did put all things under him. That did put, God put everything under Jesus. By the way, he's referring to a psalm, a corrupted Septuagint psalm, but I'm not going to get into it. But that's what it says in this psalm as it reads in the Septuagint. Next, verse 28. And when all things shall be subdued unto him, that is Jesus, then shall the Son also himself be subject unto him, that is the Father, that put all things under him, Jesus, that God may be all in all. So in other words, it's going to take stages. God's, in the Psalm, has put everything under Jesus up to a certain point. But at the very end, what Jesus does is he hands over all the kingdoms to God the Father, which is actually in the book of Daniel. So what he's doing is he's squeezing in the Psalm to read consistent with the book of Daniel. So in the book of Daniel, the Son of Man, which is the Son of God, in what Paul's talking about here, hands over everything to the Father. Okay? But in Daniel, the Messiah is not God, and is not God the Son. He's the Son of Man, which means a son of Adam, a human being. So it's very important that in the true prophecy of Daniel, of Messiah, in Daniel 9:25 and 26, it's a human being, says so, Son of Man. a title Jesus uses over 81 times, which solely means son of a human being. Okay, so what do we deduce out of this is that, according to Paul, Jesus is a person who conquers all the enemies of God. Then God intended it to be under Jesus, but only for a time. And then ultimately, Jesus, the Son, shall himself become subject unto him, the Father. This is verse 28, that put all things under him, Jesus. So clearly, this is totally offensive to Trinitarianism, which claims that Jesus is God as much as God the Father, and they're equal. This is an inequality perpetually. In other words, Jesus is going to end up turning everything over to God and becomes eternally subject to the Father. And Jesus does say the Father is greater than I, but there's always explanations that a Trinitarian will give you that they're still equal somehow. But that's not what's going on here. God the Father ends up being superior in the end to Jesus. But until then, but this is the weird thing is Paul is given Jesus preeminence until this point in time over God the Father, and we worship Jesus over and superior to God, and that's all okay. And I have all these videos I want to show you. I collected them all where Jesus is superior and it's okay to worship him alone. Forget the Father. So it's just, I mean, these are Protestant normative people. They're not crazies, but they actually say something that is completely offensive to God. So I want you to hear it, not because I want you to believe it, but I want you to understand how wed to your beliefs you can become if you don't open up and let yourself think critically about what you believe, because what you believe can send you to hell. And one of those things is the belief that you have an idol in your head, in your mind, that is a face in front of God. You violate the first commandment and you are no longer worshiping Yahweh. You're worshiping his son. Jesus is truly the Son of God. That's what we saw in Psalm 2. I do want to make clear that it's appropriate to worship Jesus as your king, because the word worship in both English and in Hebrew meant homage, meaning you can pay homage to a king. That is, you show obeisance. That means you're going to kneel in front of them. You're going to kiss their ring. You're going to do all kinds of things to show you're going to obey that person. That is totally appropriate with Jesus, but it's also the word worship. And unfortunately, a lot of people think that means it proves you're God. No, we show homage, we show worship to monarchs all the time in England. Unfortunately, we don't live in Britain anymore in that sense where we would learn the meaning of the word worship. In fact, they call cardinals my holy worship. I mean, so it's like, don't mistake what you think the word worship means is what the Bible means. So there's a passage in Chronicles where it says, and the people worshiped the Yahweh and the king. And there was no break. In other words, the subject worship was applied both to Yahweh and the king in the same sentence. So the king has the entitlement to worship in the biblical sense of homage. Okay, let's move on. Now, I want to read Philippians 2, verses 6 to 7 to prove that what Paul means in Colossians has to mean that Jesus was a God of some sort, or else the sentence doesn't make sense. So, in other words, even though Jesus is the first begotten, firstborn of God, the Father, Jesus is a God in some secondary sense, which what's my point in the episode on Paul's an Herodian is these doctrines are pagan. You can't have two gods, my friends, no matter what you believe. You got to just trust Jesus when he says the Father is the only true God. Please read John 17, 1-3 and take it seriously. But listen to what he says in Philippians 2, verses 6 to 7, King James. Who, Jesus, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon himself the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. So what does that tell you? Barry, you got to read this carefully. He's saying Jesus is not actually a man, and he was God, but he empties himself, kenosis, and he becomes, he was at least equal to God the Father, in the sense of being a God, a powerful being. But instead of staying in that station, he humbled himself, made himself of no reputation, an ordinary man, looked like an ordinary man, took upon himself the form of a servant. So he just has a form, a shape that he's a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. So he just looks like he's a human being, but he's not actually human. Now that's a very significant faux pas of Paul. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, you don't know how serious that statement is to implicate Paul in something, well, You're going to learn. I'm going to have to just show it to you. Apostle John, this is called Docetism. The word likeness there is what the word docetic comes from in Greek, and it was a heresy in the first in the 100s when Marcion was the first person who he was the person who claimed Paul was the only apostle, and based on Paul, he claimed that Jesus did not really was not a real true human being. Obviously, he was relying upon this text, and Marcion was excoriated for Docetism. Okay. And let me just read this to you. Apostle John says Docetism is the message of the Antichrist, that is of Satan. Apostle John said this: many deceivers who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in human flesh, the Greek word is sarx, S-A-R-X, human flesh, have gone out into the world. Any such person is the deceiver and the Antichrist. 2 John 1:7. So Paul is claiming he's getting all his messages from his Christ. He doesn't want to hear, in Galatians 2, he says, I did not get my message from these apostles, the pillars of the church. I got all my messages from my superior revelations from Jesus Christ in heaven. Now, who is his Jesus? He met a guy on the road to Damascus who said he was Jesus, but was he really Jesus? Well, the answer is right here. It had to be Antichrist, because what is he teaching right here? Jesus did not really come as a human being. He was never a human being. He was truly this heavenly being, second to God, the firstborn of creation. And then he, Jesus, created all things under Colossians. Exactly the doctrine of the Zeus-Apollo relationship as depicted by Plutarch in the 100s in his book entitled On the Letter E at Delphi. I went through that in the episode on the reasons, one of the reasons that Paul is an Herodian. A little bit higher resolution, Philippians 2, verse 6 to 7. So Jesus is in the form of God, right? Though not, he did not consider it robbery to be equal with God. So he's, as whatever God's form is, he has it too. And he thinks he's equal to God, but he didn't count it robbery to believe he was equal to God. Then he changed himself. What did he do? He made himself of no reputation, and he took himself the form of a servant and was made in the likeness, only the appearance of a man, but not true human flesh of a man. And that's what John calls in 2 John 1:7 the doctrine of the Antichrist. Now, you might say, oh, Doug, I've never heard of this stuff, Docetism and all that. Well, I'm going to give you a background on someone named Marcion, who emerged. He was a bishop of the church at Rome. In 144 AD, he starts up the Marcionite movement when the Roman Catholic Church expelled him for being a heretic, for the reasons you're going to see here. And one of those reasons was he taught Jesus did not have true human flesh. However, when Marcionism became powerful by 207 AD, the early church, through Tertullian's pen, battled such ideas of Marcion. So by 207, he became a major threat. Marcionism was spreading everywhere. It was a doctrine that clearly held faith alone, and that Paul is the only apostle. Maybe you've never heard of this. And again, all the things that you would question how we got here, that would make you doubt what you are looking at, is the real deal. That it's, you don't realize you're looking at a counterfeit Christianity. That's all I can tell you. It started with Roman Catholicism in 325. This was the first attempt to penetrate our church with an infiltrator. Basically, Marcion was pulling in Christians from everywhere to follow only Paul. And he got defeated. But out of those ashes came the movement later by Constantine in 325 that resurrected this whole idea of what we now have today, which is a counterfeit Christianity, I believe. Listen, please. Marcionism became powerful by 207 AD. How were they battled? Tertullian, an Orthodox member of the church, a very strong and important leader, wrote many books on behalf of Christianity, and he battled from his pen Marcion. Tertullian, a major church leader in North Africa, battled vigorously against this claim of Marcion that Paul was the only apostle and so on. He actually proved that Paul had no authority as an apostle, because you can't find it anywhere in the letters and anywhere in the New Testament that he was appointed by Jesus Christ as an apostle, other than from Paul's own mouth. And Tertullian says you can't be your own witness for that claim. That's how he won the battle against Marcionism. But what he also did is, in a separate article, he attacked Marcion's claim in the book Tertullian, the Flesh of Christ. He says to Marcion's claims, he said, Christ really became a man. So that's what was the dispute. Now, did Jesus become truly a man here? No, he never became a man. He just looked like one. That's what Paul says in Philippians 2, verses 6 to 7. As to Marcion's claim that Jesus as God could not have suffered in the flesh because his flesh was a mere phantom, Tertullian responded with alarm. Quote, he's going to tell Marcion, you said Jesus is God and he's not even a human being. So what does he respond? Tertullian says this, have you then, Marcion, cut away all sufferings from Christ on the ground that is a mere phantom, he was incapable of experiencing them? Tertullian, the flesh of Christ. And most clearly, Tertullian mocked Marcion by saying, O thou most infamous of men, who acquitted of all guilt the murderers of God, for nothing did Christ suffer from them if he really suffered nothing at all. And that's in chapter 5 of his work, The Flesh of Christ. So Tertullian is saying the Marcion heretic was saying Jesus didn't come in human flesh. He just appeared to look that way. And since he didn't really have true human flesh, Jesus didn't suffer any pain. Now you're going to tell me, Doug, that didn't go anywhere. Oh, it did. It went very far. The Catholic Church became a believer eventually when Marcionism basically resurrected in the church that you know today as Roman Catholicism. You say, oh, that can't be so. No, they were wed to Paul because he supported this doctrine that they believed that Jesus, the Roman Catholic Church believed that Jesus did not have true human flesh. And I'm going to show you the major leaders said so. I'm going to read you that from Hilary, but let me finish what he says here. Tertullian said, this is why Jesus is called the Son of Man, to tell us Jesus was indeed a true human. Quote, else why is Christ man and the Son of Man if he has nothing of man, nothing from man? Tertullian, chapter 5. So again, this idea that Jesus only came in the likeness of man, the Paul only founder of Marcionism had a totally justified position that came from Paul, and yet he's being called a heretic by Tertullian. However, in the late 300s, the Roman Catholic Church lost hold on this original Orthodox view of Tertullian. It got confused by Paul, this is me writing, and apparently by Marcion. The Roman Catholic Church now thought Jesus only appeared to be a man. It denied Jesus had human flesh, and thus denied Jesus could actually suffer pain. First, Saint Hilary of Poitiers, 300 to 368, in his work on the Trinity, said, quote, no more in the passion did the flesh of Christ feel pain than if you were to wound fire or water with a sword. Hilary de Trinitate, Book 9, Chapter 56, and Book 10, verse 23. See Nicene Father Schaff, and you just go here to page 195, and you can see the preview page doesn't show you everything, but you can see. But it clearly says here, but his nature, capitalized H, meaning Jesus' nature could not feel pain, for though his fashion was that of a man, meaning his appearance was of a man, his origin was not human. Okay, so that corroborates me. All right, so let's go back to that passage of Paul, Colossians 1:14 to 18. What does prototokos mean here? Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature, right? And what did we learn? Jesus is, according to Paul's own words, Son of God, right? So he had to be begotten. You don't become a son without being begotten. That's the whole nature of what the meaning of the word son is. Born from, taken from, generated from. So you can't get away from that. So what does Paul really mean? He means Jesus was generated by the Father. He's the firstborn of every creature. It doesn't just mean first of every creature. That's what the critics were sending me comments on. No, you have to take the tokos, which means childbirth. Then Jesus is the creator, verse 16, twice mentioned. And then he is also the firstborn of the dead. That means he was the first child born out of death, and he was the first resurrection. That's what Paul says. It's not true. Lazarus was born from the dead. But again, Paul doesn't want to know anything from the apostles. He doesn't read the Gospels. He doesn't know anything that's going on there. And he's proud about it. And he says, I got nothing from them. He says that in Galatians chapter 2. Just read it. And then he says, I get my revelations from Jesus Christ. The ascended Jesus Christ is what he means. So, and we've showed you many, many proofs of what is the problem with this. The Nicene Creed tried to fix it, but it had to admit Jesus is begotten because that's what Paul said. He's the firstborn, so they're not denying it, but then they try to erase it by saying, but he wasn't made. So somehow they conceptualize something that's impossible and self-contradictory. You could be begotten and actually not made physically, using this substitute idea that you can have one substance, meaning a homoousia in Greek. This is a substance of God is somehow in Jesus, and that circumvents the need to worry about this is a contradictory nonsense. But it isn't. It doesn't go away because God doesn't even have a substance. He's a spirit. So you just have to realize the whole Roman Catholic Church is based on these ridiculous self-contradictions, trying to deify a person who is just simply the Son of God. And that's not how it works. But Paul had a different approach, which is he could take a son of God and make him also a God by giving him all the creation of heaven and earth, and only make that Son of God have been one connection to God, and that is by being begotten by him. And that's the only thing they conceded in the Nicene Creed towards Paul. And I discussed with you that Paul calls Jesus the Son over here. So you can't get away from the Protokos. A begotten nature of Jesus has to be understood in Protokos in Colossians, first childbirth, particularly because you have here verse 28, Jesus is the Son of God. And it's in Paul's own words in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 28. And then we see if Paul is going to quote this passage we showed you in Acts from Psalm 2, it says right here, where is it? Thou art my son, this day I begotten thee, is an address by Paul's quoting this passage, which is talking about God speaking to the Messiah, the anointed one, that I will call you, I will say to you, this day I've begotten thee. That is proof positive that the Son of God, Messiah, is a begotten creature, because God actually uses the words. And Paul quotes this passage in Acts 13:16. Thou art my son, this day I've begotten thee. You can't get around it. Paul believes that God Yahweh begot Jesus. And this is the God the Father addressing Jesus, not Mary, not Joseph, but God saying, I begot you as my son of God, basically a spiritual being. And but then we saw that Paul believes this spirit being of Jesus never was truly human. He just looked human. And we showed you that, according to John, this is the doctrine of Antichrist in 2 John 1:7. And we showed you this was fought by the church, this doctrine that Jesus didn't have true human flesh. Marcion said Paul's the only apostle, and this is what Paul teaches, so we're going to follow him. Deemed heresy by everybody. Tertullian writes the book Flesh of Christ. Christ really became a man. He fights off uh, this Marcion fellow, and he says, what you're saying is Christ really didn't suffer anything because he's not really human. And you see that this corruption gets into the church later, the Roman Catholic Church, where for Hilary of Poitiers, in defense of the Trinity, says, no more in the passion did the flesh of Christ feel pain than if you were to wound fire or water with a sword. And it's right here, and I'm showing you the book on screen. You can see with your own eyes the doctrine of Paul, of his view of Jesus being a God, the Son, before he even looked like a human. Then when he came to earth, he just appeared to be human. He really didn't have flesh of human. He really didn't suffer pain. He didn't really have any fear or terror of her death, because he wasn't even feeling pain. Do you see what Satan wants you to believe about Jesus? If you read Paul and take him seriously, that's what you end up with. Now, a lot of Christians no longer take this passage in Philippians seriously. That's the solution? Just saying that he didn't write this, or you're not going to pay attention to that he wrote this? If all scripture is inspired of God, as you insist, then you have to eat this and eat your words that you believe this could be God, is somebody who just appeared to be man. And that would mean Paul is what? Right here, the deceiver and the antichrist. All right, God bless everybody. Take care. Ciao. Bye.